Hello and welcome to our podcast where we're celebrating South Asian History Month 2025 at Ashford and St Peter's Hospitals NHS Trust. The month runs from 18th July to 17th August and this year's theme is Roots to Roots. My name is Amandeep Chana and I'm an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Trust, and we have Professor Pankaj Sharma, OBE, with us today. Professor Sharma studied medicine at London University, graduating in 1988. He also holds 2 doctorates, a PhD from Gonville and Caius College, University of Cambridge, and a doctorate in medicine from London University. He's a consultant neurologist at Imperial College and Professor of Neurology at the Royal Holloway College, University of London, where he's a director of the renowned Institute of Cardiovascular Research. Here at ASPH, he is Director of Research and Development. Good morning, Professor Sharma. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We're celebrating South Asian Heritage Month. Could you tell us a bit about your South Asian heritage?
I was born in India, in central Delhi, and my father was an Indian diplomat, and so he used to travel abroad frequently for his work. So the way the Indian diplomatic service worked in those days was that the postings were 3 years out and then 3 years back. So we had a number of postings across the globe. And he came back to Delhi for 3 years, and his next posting was in London. And so we followed him to London, and that's where I grew up then, because he decided to stay on. You could do that in those days, actually. And many of our friends, actually, in the diplomatic service did stay on after their final postings in London.
And how old were you?
Oh, I was very young. I think I learned to walk on the ship that India sent over. And in those days, of course, because you were a diplomat, there was no restriction on luggage. So the trunks we used to have, metal trunks, which some of your listeners may remember from their journeys, but we used to have a lot of trunks. I think we had about 18 or 20 that came with us because there was no restriction. And of course, those trunks, most of them, my parents used to tell me, were full of spices, because they knew that when they came to the UK, they would have difficulty in cooking and making food and Indianizing that food. And you've got to bear in mind, in those days, in the late 60s, 70s, there weren't the cosmopolitan era that we have at the moment in terms of language, in terms of food, in terms of shopping. So it was very restricted, and people used to have to fly back to India or get friends who were coming from India to try and get them the food that they wanted to eat. So, of course, we were very lucky in that we had no restrictions, so we could come with a huge amount of luggage.
Sure, fascinating. I remember my grandmother's blue trunk, metal trunk that she had in her bedroom.
Yeah, ours were metal as well, and I remember we had about 18 or 20 of them, and over the years they got rusted, but they were very useful for storing various other bits and pieces, pillows and what we used to call gaddis, which you may remember, just for listeners out there, basically duvets, but heavy Indian duvets, so they all came over with us as well. And in fact, our first house was the Indian Embassy, which is still there in Aldwych. On the first floor, that was our first house in London. And it wasn't that Daddy was particularly senior in the Indian diplomatic service. It's just that he was quite well connected. And in those days, as I'm sure pretty much even now, your rank isn't really the main issue. It's who you know. And Daddy was quite well connected. And the first minister at the time, who was based in London, that was meant to be his flat. But the first secretary was his flat. But the first secretary had his own apartment in London, so he didn't want to stay in the embassy. The Indian High Commissioner then, as still now, has his own house, which is, I think, in Kensington Palace Gardens, and that's owned by the Indian government. So they offered Daddy the first floor, which was a beautiful apartment, wooden, oak, panelling everywhere, but on one condition. And that one condition was that my parents had to host the parties at the weekends. That was the only condition. And I remember growing up having parties literally every weekend, and we'd have the invitees would be other ambassadors, other diplomats. Every time an Indian Prime Minister flew over, Shastri flew over, we would have to host him because we were the family that had the apartment in the Indian Embassy.
Sounds fantastic. So this year's theme for South Asian Heritage Month is Roots to Roots. What does Roots to Roots mean to you?
the generation now that's growing up, as I'm sure you and other of our listeners will appreciate, is a much more confident generation. Certainly when I was growing up, there weren't many South Asians around. There were very few ethnic minorities. So we were always slightly in the background at the time. There was, as I'm sure many people will recognize listening, that, there was a lot of bullying going on in school. Very often a South Asian person in school would be the only South Asian or the only black or ethnic minority person in school. But now it's become a much more confident generation. I think there's obviously the numbers help, but I think the position of South Asia in the world has increased really quite markedly over the last few decades. And that has filtered down and disseminated into the diaspora across the world as well. Though they've become a lot more open about their South Asian heritage, whereas previously it was often felt that you have to sort of hide it slightly. Many of my friends actually have sort of English-sounding names, Kevin or John, because it was felt that actually it was important to be able to integrate much more closely rather than having an Indian name, which would be difficult to pronounce. So all of those factors that come into play in terms of roots to roots. And I remember my parents, when we were growing up, my parents had a single rule in our house, and that house was that the moment you enter into the house, you can speak any language that you like, but it mustn't be English. So my parents didn't mind whether you spoke French, Spanish, German, Hindi, Punjabi, doesn't matter, but it can't be English. Because the view that they took was that you're going to learn English when you go to school every day anyway. You're going to grow up learning and speaking English. It's important to be multinational, multilingual, and multicultural as well. And my parents spoke Hindi and Punjabi at home, and so that was the language that I grew up speaking as well. So it means that I'm fluent in Hindi and Punjabi as well. And unfortunately, that wasn't a rule that many other families have. So actually, that generation now, my generation, somewhat regret not having that kind of rule, and they're slightly envious of me. And in fact, I have the same rule at home as well. And my children, they're allowed to speak anything they like at home, but it mustn't be English. And in fact, my children, my son particularly, he can speak Latin, Italian, French, and obviously English and Hindi and Punjabi, and I don't mind what he speaks. And often when he's wanting to speak to me or not wanting to tell me anything, he'll speak in Latin or Italian, which I won't be able to understand. So I know that he's trying to hide something from me.
Sure, that's so fascinating. I'm sure there's so much there that our listeners will resonate with. I'm wondering how you stay connected to your roots.
I'm afraid I'm one of those people that has to have Indian food every day. If I don't have an Indian meal in the evening, I get very irritable, and my wife and my kids know that very well. So, the kids will want sort of, a pizza or something on a Friday night, which is fine. But almost every day I have to have, roti sabji, which your Asian listeners will fully appreciate. But basically, sort of Indian food every day. So that's a connection. And in fact, the beauty is that my children also have grown up with that as well. So they miss Indian food as well. Not probably as much as I do. They still like their Chinese and their Thai and their French food or whatever. But that really connects us to an Indian culture and heritage. During my work, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a few moments, but I travel a lot internationally, and I have a lot of research going on in India. So I fly to India probably 3 or 4 times a year as well. So that helps me connect as well. But also importantly, what I try and do is make sure that my family, my children and my wife, we all go to India at least once a year. So that helps us keep connected as well. Unfortunately, I would fail the Tebet test. Now, either you or your listeners may or may not know about Norman Tebbit, Lord Tebbit, who died actually just a few weeks ago. He was a cabinet minister in Margaret Thatcher's time, and his test that he applied when he was once asked by a journalist or in a speech that he gave, how do you tell whether someone's truly British or not, particularly if they come from another country? And his response was that it depends on who they support in a cricket match. So if India versus England were playing at Lord's, who would you support? Would you support England, the country that you live in, or would you support India, the country that your ancestors came from. And I'm afraid my son and I, we are really, really powerful supporters of India. So we would fail the Tebet test, I'm afraid, in terms of culture. But of course, that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the match. You can't enjoy the sport. And of course, we'll support England at other times. But I'm afraid when it comes to an England versus India match, it's going to be India every time.
That sounds like such a difficult choice for so many people, I imagine. I imagine that would be. So you've relatively recently received an OBE. I understand that your OBE has been awarded for 2 decades of research work on stroke in the British South Asian population, a group that is often understudied but has a high cardiovascular morbidity and mortality risk. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in this area and why it interests you?
Yeah, it was very humbling to receive the OBE, and I'm very grateful that the work has been recognised. But I think it's important for me to say right from the outset, as you have emphasised, that it's 20 years of work. And it's not just my work, it's a whole group of people that I've led over those 20 years. So from my perspective, I certainly recognise that OBE as a recognition for the group's work and the people that have worked for 20 years chipping away at the research that we've been doing. And also, I think right from the outset, I should say that I could not have possibly have done that work without the help of the patients that have contributed to it. So I think it's very important to recognise all of that. And each person who's contributed to that work, no matter how big or small, they are equally represented in the OBE that was granted. So I'm very grateful to receive it. That's a very humbling experience. So just to remind people what the kind of work that we do. So I'm interested in cardiovascular disease, as you say. That's high blood pressure, diabetes and stroke, but particularly in the South Asian population. And what we do, we recruit patients who have had a stroke from across the globe. So there are about 23 sites, I think, in the UK from where we recruit South Asian stroke patients. We recruit from 3 or 4 sites in India, a site in the Middle East, and also a site in Sri Lanka as well. And we've accumulated a biobank, essentially a repository, which I think is, off the top of my head, probably the world's largest repository of South Asian stroke. And what that has enabled us to do is try and understand what are the causes and the consequences of stroke and cardiovascular disease in the South Asian population. Now, just to put that into perspective for your listeners, stroke is the 3rd biggest killer in the UK. It doesn't matter what nationality or background or ancestral background you come from. It's the 3rd biggest killer in the UK. It's the 2nd largest cause of dementia as well, the first being Alzheimer's, but it's the 2nd largest cause of dementia. And it consumes probably around, if I'm guessing, 7 or 8% of the entire NHS budget. So it is a huge burden on the NHS. And the South Asian patients who suffer from stroke, actually they suffer earlier stroke and they suffer more severe stroke as well because they present later. And why do they present later? They probably present later because they don't understand the NHS system. They don't engage so much in the medical system. They also don't exercise as much. Their food is very carbohydrate rich, which is a historical artifact from people that came over from India. When you're eating carbohydrate rich food in India, it's not so much of a problem if you live in rural India because you're going to be burning it all away. But unfortunately, that food has kept being eaten in the UK when, of course, there's not much rural work going on. So all of those factors have led to South Asians having earlier stroke, more severe stroke. And most of that, a lot of that has been proven by the brain study that I've led over the last 20 years.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I'm wondering, what role has your heritage played in your work in healthcare?
I have concentrated on South Asian patients, and I guess the reason I gravitated towards South Asian patients was because of my heritage. I didn't start out saying I'm South Asian, therefore I'm only going to look at South Asians. It was an opportunity that arose. Everybody was doing stroke and cardiovascular research in Caucasian populations, obviously, because we live in a population which is predominantly Caucasian. Researchers were mostly Caucasian as well. So I was slightly out on my own. So the opportunity that arose was to be able to engage with the South Asian community. I was able to do that probably easier because I could speak the language, I look like them, I eat like them, and I behave like them. So it was easier for me to, if I can put it this way, infiltrate the community, but also use my heritage to educate the community about the diet and about exercise. So all of that would have not been possible, I don't think, had I not been of South Asian heritage. Now, I should say that the people that worked on the Brains Project for the last 20 years, the majority are not South Asians. The majority have been of different nationalities, including British, but they're all interested in the research and they're all interested in the outcome. But as the leader, I think because I had a South Asian heritage, I was able to start that project, which I think other people would probably have had more difficulty in doing so.
Sure. And I'm wondering, what has the research led to? What changes have resulted as a result of the research?
The papers are now beginning to come out. You've got to bear in mind that it's taken 10 or 15 years to recruit the patients. And what we're now finding is that we've proven now in papers that have been published that stroke patients from South Asian heritage suffer from stroke up to 22 years earlier than a comparative British white person. So it's almost a quarter of your life is lost because you come from a South Asian ancestry. That's not necessarily due to the fact that you're eating badly or you're not exercising. By virtue of the fact that you were born South Asian, of that ancestry, you have potentially a stroke 22 years earlier. And that has come from the brain study. And of course, what we've tried to do then is influence government policy, chip away at government policy to say that they should concentrate on the efforts of study on advertisements like the FAST trial, which people will have seen on the back of a bus, which is face, arm, and speech. If any of that is effective, it's time to call 999 because you might be having a stroke. But that was fine if you speak English and you understand the acronym of FAST. That's fine. But if you're Punjabi speaking, FAST is meaningless to you because fast in Punjabi or Hindi is jaldi.
Yes.
And jaldi doesn't make any sense when it comes to trying to get across your face or your arm or your speech test. So we've chipped away, and hopefully then the most recent advertising that's been around the FAST campaign has actually concentrated on ethnic minorities. And I've helped sort of government campaigns on radio, cable television, specialist organizations that concentrate on South Asian and ethnic minority communities to get that message out. And a lot of that information has come from the brain study.
That sounds like such important work. Well, it is such important work, and I'm sure there are many people in the community who are benefiting from that. How would you describe the path that you've taken in your professional life in the NHS?
I was very fortunate that I had a lot of support from a lot of people in the NHS and in academia. So I'm sort of 50-50 NHS and university most of my career, and I've had a lot of support. But the reason I ended up in neurology was actually because one very influential person in neurology said to me when I was a very junior doctor trying to figure out which career I should go in medicine, which speciality I should go in, I was told very clearly that I would never have a career in British neurology. You've got to bear in mind that at that time, I was probably one of the few, if any, non-white people to want to go into neurology. Neurology has always been a very conservative profession, and I was told that I would never have a career in British neurology. And I was obviously gutted at the time because it was something I was considering. I wasn't wedded to the idea. I could quite easily have gone into another speciality. I was quite interested in care of the elderly medicine because I was interested in stroke. And stroke is a care of the elderly profession, really. It's a really speciality that lends itself very well to it. So I was perfectly happy to go into that. But when I was told that I would never have a career in British neurology, I immediately knew that I was going to go into British neurology. And that's how I ended up in my current speciality. So in many ways, I'm very grateful for the fact that that someone tried to put me off it, because had it not been for that, I could quite easily have gone into any other speciality, and perhaps I wouldn't have been able to create the brains biobank, which have led to all the benefits that you and I have just discussed.
That sounds like such a powerful thing for someone to have said to you in so many ways. What advice would you give to younger South Asians who are just starting out in their careers, especially in healthcare?
So I would take the opposite view from you, actually. You start your premise by saying advice to South Asians. In fact, the advice that I would give to South Asians is the advice that I would give to anybody, actually. It doesn't matter what your ancestral background is, and that is follow your passion. It doesn't matter, whether you're Chinese, black, white, South Asian, you've got to follow your passion. You're going to be doing a career for 40 years. You better enjoy it. Healthcare still remains, I think, one of the most interesting professions in the world. The job is never the same on a day-to-day basis. It still remains the most trusted profession in the world. And if you're not passionate about it and you're not interested in treating patients, you've got to enjoy the people. If you don't enjoy talking to people, you're in the wrong game. And that applies whether you're South Asian, whether you're Chinese, whether you're black, whether you're white. It doesn't matter. Do it with passion.
Very good advice, I think. Looking ahead, how do you hope your story, your route, will continue to evolve?
Well, I'm going to carry on with the brain study. Obviously, we're only just starting to tap into the data that's taken decades to collect. And I hope that my group and I will continue to make significant advances in our understanding of cardiovascular disease in South Asians. And with that understanding, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to improve the lives of ethnic minorities living not just in the UK, but across the globe. You've got to bear in mind, by the way, that the vast majority of research that's done in the world is done in Caucasian populations. And yet Caucasian populations, white populations, make up 20% of the world's population. 80% of the world's population is not white, yet almost all the research that's done in the world is in white populations. Now, that's not to criticize it. That's just to say that that's where we are. It's a factual observation that we're making. But, 20% of the world's population is Chinese. 20% of the world's population is South Asian. 20% of the world's population is of African heritage, at least. And there's so little research that's going on. How do we help improve the lives of those populations when a lot of the research money is going into a different population, which is fine, and we can learn from that. But it is time to move the dial along now and say, let's look at the other 80% of the world's population. And that's what I'm hoping to chip away at.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for taking the time to be with us today. I'd also like to say thank you to you, the listener, for listening to our podcast. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope that you've taken something useful from it. Thank you to everyone, and see you soon.